Elira Voss grew up knowing exactly where she stood in her pack, and it was never anywhere near the top. Her family name used to mean something, a long time ago, before her grandfather made a decision that cost the pack a war they didn't need to fight. Nobody talked about the details anymore. They didn't have to. The Voss name did the talking for them, in the way people looked away when she walked into a room, in the way she was never asked to speak first at pack meetings, in the way even the children knew, without being told, that she was someone to be polite to but never close to. She was used to it by the time she turned 22. Used to being the girl at the edge of the gathering, the one who helped set up chairs but never sat in the front ones. Used to smiling at people who didn't smile back. It wasn't a tragic life, not the kind you'd cry over. It was just quiet, and small, and hers. The one thing that broke through that quiet was the choosing moon. Every wolf in the northern packs knew about it, even the ones who pretended not to care. Once a year, on a night when the moon hung low and full over the training grounds, unmated wolves gathered from every pack in the territory. It was supposed to be a night of hope. Somewhere in that crowd, if the old stories were true, your mate was standing too, waiting for the bond to click into place the moment your eyes met. Elira had gone to 3 choosing moons before this one. Nothing had ever happened. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself a lot of things. This year was different only because of who was attending. King Draven Ashcroft, ruler of the northern packs, had never once shown up to a choosing moon in the 6 years since he took the throne. Kings weren't required to attend. Most assumed he'd simply find someone through the usual channels of politics and alliance, the way kings before him had. But this year, word spread that he was coming, and the whole territory buzzed with a kind of nervous excitement that made even Elira's chest feel a little tighter than usual. She almost didn't go. She stood in front of the mirror in the small room she shared with 2 cousins, wearing a dress that used to belong to someone else, and thought about staying home instead. But her grandmother, the only person in the family who ever looked at her without pity, told her to go anyway. "You don't go for the king," her grandmother said. "You go because the moon doesn't care what your last name is." So she went. The training grounds were packed by the time she arrived, torches lining the field, the air cold enough that everyone's breath showed in small white clouds. She found a spot near the back, out of habit more than anything, and watched as the pack elders took their places at the front. She wasn't expecting anything. She never expected anything on these nights anymore. That was the trick to surviving them without feeling like a fool afterward. Then the crowd near the front began to shift, and murmurs rolled backward through the field like a wave, and Elira realized the king himself was walking through the gathering. She'd never seen him up close before. Pictures didn't do him justice. Not that she'd spent much time looking at pictures of him, she told herself. He was tall in the specific way that made people instinctively step back, broad-shouldered, dressed simply for someone with a crown, dark hair pushed back like he hadn't had time to think about it that morning. He walked like someone used to rooms going silent when he entered them. And then his eyes found hers. She felt it before she understood it, a pull, sudden and complete, like something inside her chest had been asleep for 22 years and had just woken up all at once. The noise of the crowd fell away. She stopped breathing without deciding to. Across the field, she watched the king go still too, his jaw tightening, something flickering across his face that she couldn't read. It was him. The bond had chosen him. For one impossible second, she let herself believe something good was about to happen to her. Then his expression closed like a door. "I reject this bond," he said. He said it loud enough for the pack elders to hear, loud enough for the whole field to hear, loud enough that there was no mistaking it for anything other than exactly what it was. The words hit her like cold water. She felt her knees buckle before her mind caught up with what her body already understood. Somewhere behind her, someone gasped. Somewhere closer, someone laughed, quiet and mean, the kind of laugh reserved for watching a Voss get exactly what people expected a Voss to get. The king didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize. He turned and walked back through the crowd that parted for him like water, and within minutes, he was gone from the field entirely, leaving Elira on her knees, in the frost, with several hundred people watching her figure out how to stand back up. She didn't cry. Not there. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who wanted to see you cry only gave them something to talk about for longer. She got up, brushed the frost off her knees, and walked home with her chin level, even though every step felt like it belonged to someone else. She expected the humiliation to fade the way most humiliations did, slowly, over weeks, until it became just another story people forgot to keep telling. She did not expect a royal messenger to show up at her door 4 days later. The messenger was young, nervous, holding a scroll like it might bite him. He informed her, in the careful language of someone reciting words he didn't fully understand himself, that under an old statute of the Ashcroft bloodline, a rejected mate of confirmed Pack lineage was required to reside within the royal household for a period of 1 year, for reasons of crown stability. Elira read the scroll twice before she let herself believe it was real. "This has to be a mistake," she said. "It's not, miss," the messenger said, apologetic in the way of someone who knew this was a strange thing to be delivering. "The council confirmed it themselves. You're to be moved to the castle by the end of the week." She wanted to refuse. She actually opened her mouth to say so. But the messenger explained, gently, that refusal wasn't really an option offered by the law, not for someone of Pack standing as low as hers, not when the alternative was being formally cast out of Northern Pack protection altogether. It wasn't a request. It had never been a request. Kings didn't request things from people like her. She packed what little she owned into a single bag 2 days later. Her grandmother helped her fold the borrowed dress she'd worn to the choosing moon, the one she still hadn't returned to her cousin. "He rejected you in front of everyone," her grandmother said, not unkindly. "And now the law is making him live with you anyway. There's something almost funny about that, if you squint." "I don't feel like squinting," Elira said. Her grandmother smiled anyway, and hugged her, and told her to write when she could, and Elira left for the castle the next morning with a bag over her shoulder and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The castle was bigger than anything she'd imagined, all gray stone and long hallways that seemed to go on without any real destination. A member of the household staff met her at the gate, a calm older woman named Ophelia, who didn't ask a single question about the situation, which Elira appreciated more than she expected to. Ophelia led her to a wing on the eastern side of the building, far enough from the king's own quarters that Elira understood the distance was intentional. "You'll take your meals separately unless told otherwise," Ophelia said, setting Elira's bag down in a room far nicer than anything she'd ever slept in. "His Majesty asked that you not be disturbed, and that you not disturb him." "Sounds like he's really looking forward to this year," Elira said. Ophelia's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd shown so far. "He didn't say that, but I imagine you're not wrong." For the first 2 weeks, Elira barely saw him at all. She heard him sometimes, boots on stone somewhere down a hallway, a door closing a little too hard. Once she passed him in a corridor and he looked at her the way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong building, brief and blank, before walking on without a word. It stung more than she wanted it to. She told herself it shouldn't. He'd made his feelings clear enough in front of half the territory already. She filled her days the only way she knew how, by making herself useful. She wasn't built for sitting in a fancy room doing nothing, not after a life of always needing to earn her place. She found the kitchens, and helped where she could, until the kitchen staff got used to her enough to stop being surprised when she showed up. She found the small library on the ground floor, and started reading through it, one book at a time, mostly to have something to do with the hours that stretched out long and empty in a castle where nobody particularly wanted her there. She also, without really planning to, started noticing things about Draven. She noticed that he ate dinner alone every night, even though there was a massive table clearly meant for more than one person. She noticed that he flinched, just slightly, whenever anyone mentioned his father, the old king, who had died before Draven took the throne. She noticed that despite his cold, closed-off manner, the The staff spoke about him with something close to loyalty rather than fear, the kind of loyalty that usually means a person is better underneath than they let on. None of that changed the fact that he'd rejected her in front of everyone she knew, but it made the shape of her anger a little more complicated than it had been at first. The first real conversation between them happened almost by accident, 3 weeks into the year, when Elira got lost trying to find her way back from the library after midnight and ended up in a part of the castle she didn't recognize. She turned a corner and nearly walked straight into him. Draven looked as surprised as she felt, standing there in the dim hallway with a candle in one hand, like he'd been out walking with no particular destination either. "You're up late," he said. It wasn't unkind. It also wasn't warm. "I got lost," she admitted. "This place doesn't believe in signs, apparently." Something flickered across his face, and for one strange second she thought he might actually laugh. He didn't, but he didn't walk away either. "East wing's this way," he said, nodding down the hall. "I'll walk you back." They walked in silence for a while, the candle throwing soft shadows on the stone walls. Elira wasn't sure what made her say it. Maybe just tiredness. Maybe just 3 weeks of swallowing the same question over and over. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "In front of everyone. You could have at least done it quietly." He was quiet for a few steps before answering. "It wasn't about you," he said finally. "That's all I can tell you right now." "That's not an answer." "I know," he said. "It's the only one I've got." They reached the door to her wing, and he stopped, holding the candle up just enough that she could see her way inside. "Good night, Elira," he said, and it was the first time he'd said her name at all since the choosing moon. She stood in her doorway and watched him walk away, and told herself it didn't mean anything that hearing her own name in his voice had done something strange and unwelcome to her chest. After that night, small things started to shift, slowly enough that Elira almost didn't notice until she looked back and realized how much had changed. Draven started showing up to dinner some nights, sitting at the far end of the long table at first, then gradually closer, until one evening he simply sat across from her without either of them commenting on it. He was still guarded, still careful with his words, but the ice in him had a few cracks in it now, and she found herself, against her better judgment, curious about what was underneath. He asked her, one evening, about her family, and she told him the short version, the Voss name, and everything it cost her, expecting the usual pity or the usual dismissal. Instead, he just listened, really listened, in a way most people never bothered to. "That's not fair," he said, when she finished. "None of that was your doing. Tell that to my pack," she said, trying to keep it light. "I might," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was joking. In turn, she started noticing the things he never talked about. His father's death was a subject that made the whole room go quiet whenever it came up, staff included, like there was an unspoken rule that nobody was allowed to ask questions about it. Elira wasn't foolish enough to push, not yet. But she started paying attention, the way she'd learned to pay attention to everything in a life where nobody ever explained things to her directly. She noticed the way Draven's guard, an older wolf named Cassius, who'd clearly served the family for decades, watched Draven sometimes with an expression that looked almost like worry. She noticed that certain council members, when they visited the castle, spoke to Draven with a kind of careful respect that didn't quite match the warmth she saw from people like Ophelia and Cassius. A respect that felt more like caution than loyalty. She didn't understand any of it yet, but she understood enough to know that something about this castle and this king ran a lot deeper than a rejected bond and an old law. Months passed the way months do, slow when you're living them and fast when you look back. Elira and Draven settled into something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite anything else either, a comfortable orbit around each other that neither of them named out loud. They started walking the castle grounds together some evenings, not because either of them suggested it directly, but because it just started happening, the way habits do when nobody stops them. She learned he had a dry sense of humor buried under all that formality, the kind that came out sideways when he wasn't trying. She learned he cared more about the pack's smaller villages than the council gave him credit for, that he read reports on harvests and water supplies late into the night when he thought nobody was watching. She learned that underneath the king there was just a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had never once been allowed to put it down. He learned things about her too, that she wasn't as tough as she pretended to be, not all the way through, that she still flinched, just slightly, when people brought up her family name, the same way he flinched at the mention of his father, that she noticed things other people missed and remembered them, and that when she asked him questions, she actually waited for real answers instead of the polished ones he gave everyone else. The bond between them, the one he'd rejected out loud on the training grounds all those months ago, hadn't gone anywhere. It never had. It sat quietly underneath everything they said and didn't say to each other, a current neither of them could fully shut off no matter how careful they tried to be. Some nights, sitting across from him at that too long table, Elira caught him looking at her in a way that had nothing cold in it at all, and she wondered, not for the first time, what exactly he'd meant when he said the rejection wasn't about her. She got her answer sooner than she expected, and not from him. It happened on an evening when Draven was away at a border meeting, one of the few times all year he'd left the castle overnight. Elira was in the library when Cassius found her, the old guard settling into the chair across from hers, with the slow care of a man who'd been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "You should know something," Cassius said, "before this year is out. He won't tell you himself. He's too stubborn and too scared, though he'd never use that word." Elira set her book down. Scared of what? Cassius was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way old soldiers do, carefully, like each one cost something. "His mother," he said finally, "was killed. Not by illness, the way the official record says. She was murdered, not long after Draven's father claimed her publicly as his mate. There are people in this territory, powerful people, who don't want a strong, settled alpha line. An alpha who's alone, who has no one close to him, is easier to manage, easier to pressure. The moment an alpha claims someone, that person becomes a target too." The room felt very still. "And his father?" Elira asked, already dreading the answer. "Died the same way, years later, once it became clear he wouldn't stop investigating what happened to his wife. The official record calls it an accident. Draven doesn't believe that, and neither do I." Elira sat with that for a long moment, pieces falling into place she hadn't even realized she'd been collecting. The rejection on the training grounds, the distance he'd kept at first, the flinch whenever his father came up. "He rejected me to protect me," she said slowly. "He rejected you," Cassius said, "because the moment the bond showed itself in front of the whole territory, everyone who wanted him weak saw exactly who he'd protect at any cost. Rejecting you publicly, coldly, was the only way to make them think you didn't matter to him. It was cruel to you. It was also, in his mind, the only thing keeping you alive." Elira felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been closed off and guarded since the night on the training grounds. Not just anger anymore, something far more complicated than that. "He should have told me," she said. "Yes," Cassius agreed. "He should have. I've told him the same thing more times than I can count. He's stubborn in the particular way of men who've watched everyone they've ever claimed die for it. He'd rather be hated by you than responsible for losing you too." Draven returned from the border meeting 2 days later, tired and travel-worn, and found Elira waiting for him in the same hallway where they'd first really talked, months earlier. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You should have told me," she said, "about your mother, your father, why you really rejected me. I had to hear it from Cassius, not from you." He went very still, the way he always did when something touched the parts of himself he kept locked away. For a moment she thought he might simply walk past her, retreat into the silence he was so good at. He didn't. "I didn't want you to know," he said quietly, "because knowing changes nothing except how much you're afraid every day for the rest of your life. I wasn't trying to protect a secret. I was trying to protect you from carrying the same fear I've carried since I was old enough to understand what happened to my mother. That wasn't your choice to make for me," Elira said, but there was less fire in it than she'd planned. I've spent my whole life being told what I'm worth, by people who never bothered to ask me. I thought you were different, and instead you decided, all on your own, that I couldn't handle the truth. I know, he said. I know that now. I've known it for a while, honestly, longer than I've been willing to admit out loud. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see just how tired he actually was. Not from the border meeting, but from carrying all of this alone for years. I never stopped wanting the bond, Elira. Not for one single day since that night on the training grounds. I stood there and rejected the one thing I actually wanted, in front of everyone, because I couldn't stand the thought of watching it happen to you too. My mother, my father. I couldn't do that to someone else. I especially couldn't do it to you. The hallway was quiet, except for the sound of a single torch crackling somewhere down the corridor. Elira felt everything she'd been holding on to for months, the humiliation, the confusion, the slow, unwilling warmth she hadn't wanted to admit was growing in her chest, all of it settling into something simpler and steadier than she expected. Then we figure it out together, she said. Not you deciding things alone in the dark and calling it protection. Together. Something in his face broke open, relief and grief, and something that looked almost like hope, all tangled together. Together, he agreed. Knowing the truth changed things, but it didn't make the danger disappear. If anything, the danger became sharper, more immediate, because the year was almost over, and everyone on the council, who'd benefited from an unattached, isolated king, knew exactly what the end of that year would mean if the bond was reclaimed in public. Draven and Elira spent the last stretch of the year working together in a way that surprised even Cassius, who'd known Draven since he was a boy and had rarely seen him trust anyone with the details of pack politics the way he now trusted Elira. She had a talent for reading people that years of being underestimated had sharpened into something almost sharp enough to be a weapon. She noticed which council members grew tense whenever Draven mentioned strengthening protections around mated pairs. She noticed which ones asked a few too many careful questions about how the anniversary of the choosing moon would be handled. Slowly, carefully, with Cassius's help and the quiet loyalty of staff, who'd apparently been waiting years for someone to finally investigate the old king's death properly, they built a picture of exactly which council members had a hand in what happened to Draven's parents, and exactly what they stood to lose if Draven claimed a mate publicly and settled the Alpha line for good. It wasn't a simple picture, and it wasn't without risk. There were nights Elira lay awake, wondering if she'd traded a quiet, small, overlooked life for a dangerous one. And there were nights Draven all but begged her to reconsider, to let him send her somewhere safe and finish this fight without her in it. She refused every single time. "You've spent your whole life protecting people by pushing them away," she told him, one of those nights, sitting across from him at the too long table that finally felt like it belonged to both of them instead of just him. "I've spent my whole life being pushed away by people who decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I'm done with both of those things. So are you, whether you've noticed yet or not." He hadn't argued after that. The anniversary of the choosing moon arrived the way most important days do, quieter than expected right up until it wasn't. The same training grounds, the same torches, the same pack elders standing at the front, though this time Cassius stood close behind Draven, and several members of staff Elira had come to trust stood scattered through the crowd, watching for exactly the kind of trouble they now knew to expect. The council members responsible for the old king's death had grown desperate in the final weeks, desperate enough to grow careless, and Cassius's quiet investigation had gathered enough proof to bring before the full pack assembly rather than just the closed council chambers where those same men had buried the truth for years. Draven had planned it carefully. The claiming and the reckoning would happen the same night, in front of the same crowd that had watched the rejection a year earlier, so there would be no room left for anyone to twist the story afterward. Elira stood on that field again, in the same spot almost exactly, wearing a dress that was actually hers this time, watching Draven walk toward her the way he had a year earlier, except now his face held nothing closed off at all. "A year ago," he said, loud enough for the whole field to hear, the same way his rejection had been loud enough for the whole field to hear. I stood on this ground and rejected the one bond I have ever wanted, because I was afraid of what claiming her would cost. I was wrong to make that choice for her. I was wrong to let fear decide what she deserved to know. I won't make that mistake again. He reached for her hand, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all. I claim this bond, he said, in front of everyone who's ever doubted either of us. Elira Voss is my mate, and anyone who has a problem with that can bring it to me directly, instead of hiding behind a council chamber the way certain people in this crowd have been doing for years. The murmur that ran through the field this time was entirely different from the one a year ago. Somewhere near the front, several council members went very pale, and Cassius stepped forward with the proof they'd gathered, laying out for the whole assembled pack exactly what had happened to the old king and queen, and exactly who was responsible. It wasn't a clean, tidy ending. Justice rarely is. There were arguments that stretched late into the night, and hard conversations that took weeks to fully settle, and a council that had to be rebuilt from the ground up once the truth came fully into the light. But it was an honest ending, finally, after years of secrets that had cost Draven both of his parents and nearly cost him the one person who'd refused to let him carry all of it alone. A year that started with Elira kneeling in the frost, humiliated in front of everyone she'd ever known, ended with her standing on the same ground, chosen this time in front of that same crowd, not because an old law forced anyone into anything, but because both of them had finally chosen honesty over fear. She still thought about her grandmother's words sometimes, about the moon not caring what your last name was. It turned out the moon had known something Elira hadn't been ready to believe back then. It hadn't made a mistake that night. It had just taken both of them a whole year, a lot of stubbornness, and one very old, very dangerous secret to catch up to what it already knew. The Voss name still meant something different in that territory than it used to. These days, though, when people said it, they didn't lower their voices to do it.